And we're back for part two on executive presence. Let's pick up where we left off.
You gave why it's hard was that it's hard to give it, or this isn't enough time to give it. But I do think people are avoiding it, and it is preventing people from being mentored up. You don't see that?
Okay, so Rania, let me flip it back to you. How would you answer the question you just posed to me?
I can only speak how we handle it here at the Brain Trust, which is you pass them to me.
So,
So I get to, it's almost easier to hear it from somebody else, and then you get them back, and the vulnerable parts were discussed with me, maybe. And we would do it the
so
other way. Maybe there were topics that I wouldn't want to talk about with a client, so I pass them to you, and I get them back, and they still have their privacy in those areas.
yeah, I think that you've touched on several points very well, and I'll just highlight one of them, which is this. Um, it's not easy. Okay, even as an external sort of coach, talking about some of these things, because they speak to identity. You've got somebody who's got an entire lifetime of doing things one particular way, and you've got to be a very, very sensitive coach and educator to make sure that you are respectful of the client and their background and how they are. And part of it is to help them make their own decisions by reflecting back to them some of the things that you see, or to ask them questions and help them sort of come to their own conclusions along the way. Um, I don't think it's very difficult. For example, if you had a 70, I'm certainly not 70, okay? If you had a 70-year-old man speaking to a 35-year-old woman, for example, talking about executive presence and everything, there's a very different sort of vibe coming. It's different generations, like several generations away. There's a gender difference. There may be, some cultural background or racial differences and everything. So, when you're doing this kind of executive presence coaching, you've got to make sure that some of these differences are not so stark, so that there's respect from where it's actually coming from. And part of the respect is by removing some of these differences. Excuse me. And part of the respect is by way of the um, interactions that actually happen between that coach and the individual. When it comes to a manager giving this kind of feedback, um, I think it's very difficult when a manager says, "Gee, when you come into the office, we expect you to look professional." Okay, well, fine. Somebody says, "What does that mean?" Well, you shouldn't be wearing yoga pants, etc., but you should be wearing this and that, whatever. All of a sudden, you're into this prescriptive kind of thing. And there's no way that you're going to be able to say, here's the 17 things you're not allowed to wear, and here's the 32 things you're allowed to wear. And then all of a sudden, the next year's fashion is thing number 33 or on the list. And gee, so what's better is to talk through from an employer's perspective is principles. You know, Certainly in the consulting world, which is where I inhabited for many, many years, not so much now, but the rule was, gee, when you go into a on-site with a client, you want to kind of look like them, or maybe a step up from them, and therefore, if you went to a workplace where nobody wore a tie and nobody wore a suit jacket, I'm talking about for me as a man, you did not come in wearing a tie and suit jacket. So on the other hand, if you went into a particular financial institution that was very stuffy with three-piece suits and ties and the whole bit, okay, you couldn't show up without without a tie. Same thing with respect to geography. I remember I went to a client in the UK, and in the United States, which is where most of my clients were and where our offices were. People would typically wear a logoed button-down shirt, right? A logo of the name of the company. And that was kind of the uniform that everybody wore. And certainly in the tech space, everybody had a version of that, one way or the other. Well, guess what? In the UK, that was not the uniform, if you will. Everybody wore a tie. I don't know if this particular year that's exactly what the case is. It's certainly become a little bit more informal here. In many financial institutions, nobody wears a tie, or most people don't, right? So it really depends on the role and where it is. But the idea of saying, how do we match? How do we mirror? How do we, wear clothes that or act in a particular way, or communicate in a particular, whatever it is, in a way that matches the needs of those who we're actually interacting with, right? And I think that makes it more difficult for managers to be prescriptive and say, this is precisely what you should do, and this is precisely what you shouldn't do. They can give examples, they could model the behaviors, they could model actually what they're wearing as well, but they could model those things, right? And when somebody comes outside the band, you can have the conversation. Gee, you know something. I'm wondering why fill in the blank. Is there something I need to know, right? Etc. So I think it's the conversation. It's not a question of litigiousness. It's not a question of anything other than being sensitive and frankly modeling in your own behaviors and in what you're doing, what you're hoping for your team members to be doing as well.
You gave an example of like maybe not best fit coaching dynamic, and the example you gave was the 70-something-year-old male and the 35-year-old female may not be the right fit. But Randall, for me, and this person, one of my executive presence coaches is an 80-something-year-old, and I respect him for his age and love him for his perspective, and I don't have a problem with the age or the gender. For me, I think, you asked before, what advice, like how would I do it? I think for me, it's through the relationship that the feedback is given. And I think a key component is having permission to give it, right? Like if they want to receive it and seek you out and express that they want it, for me, that's really, really key. And if you can demonstrate that you have their best interest at heart, right? Then they can hear it. And for me, I think it's not if I were you, I would this, but it's through an understanding of them that you can say, because you're you, you could do it this way. I don't like it when someone says, if I were you, because you're you. I want them to understand me. So then at that point, the question still remains, will they implement? Will they change? Will that change last? You gave examples that you needed a few reminders through your career that you've gone a little astray on the wardrobe choices, right? So there are, in the other areas of executive presence, the clothing is the easy one because it's literally a quick change, easy fix. But when it comes to how you speak or, how you show up, sometimes it's not so easy to change.
No, it absolutely isn't. Okay. And step one is are you aware of what you need to change into? Okay, or where you need the training, or where you need the reminding, right? If people are not aware of it, that's step one. Step two is really a question of reinforcement, and the test drive of exactly, let me try this, let me see how comfortable I am, and maybe doing something in a different way might be a little uncomfortable, or you maybe need more training for it. I don't know what it is. Okay, but if you spent the entire life sort of doing stuff a particular way, and you recognize that if you did it a slightly different way, which you might be uncomfortable with doing at the very beginning, it'll lead to better outcomes. And you truly understand that. You can't just, turn off a lifetime of habit or a lifetime of this is the way I've always done it, right? So of course you're going to need some reminders, or of course you need some reinforcement, etc. That's why, going to a one and done training often doesn't really stick as well as you might actually want. The idea of actually having some reinforcement. This is the kind of thing that helps along the way, right? And I think this is key. With respect to, the 80 plus mentor of yours. I know who you're talking about, a very, 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 very talented man. But I think what he was able to do with you, very simply, is build a super strong, respectful relationship, and that's what opened the door to any comments that and any feedback or any ideas that he had to share with you. And I think that, you know, from a leader to their team, it's the very same thing. You know, if you're able to create the space where there's this respect and openness to learn, you know, anything's possible. And that has to do with whether it's, you know, figuring out how to sell more, okay, or to deliver better financial results or reporting, etc., or whether it be the market impact of what you're doing, or at an individual level, your particular executive presence. All these things thrive in when the culture and when the relationship between the particular person and their manager is a positive one, right? I'll also say this: not every manager understands how to mentor and coach up their particular team members, and that's a skill too that needs to be learned. I think the days of the authoritarian command and control type management style, yeah, some people still practice it, but it's not as effective as when you've got everybody, you know, when you're using everybody's brains and everybody's individual efforts and everyone's motivated beyond just fear, right? And I think that that also is something that can be taught.
Changing directions here a little bit. Do you think, we're in North America here, we're in Canada. Do you think our perceptions of what executive presence is like very cultural to our geography? Do you think the core qualities transcend that? Or like there are cultural norms, you know, within different societies that you talked about the blue hair and the facial jewelry as you described it, you know, is it harder? Is it easier to be that executive within your own geography?
Boy, that's a great question. Um,
Even
it's
regionally,
easier.
think of Texas to California to, you know?
Oh yes. So listen, the idea of the cultural differences between California and New York is vast. The difference between southern United States and the Midwest is very, very, very different. The difference between, for example, in a First Nations community and in a you know non-First Nations city, for example, are very, very different. The difference between an Asian-focused community within this country and one, for example, that is Caribbean, okay, culturally different between all of these different groups, etc. But at the core, we're all people, right? And if we go back to how I define executive presence, which is your ability to inspire confidence in others. And what we're talking about is, number one, what are the buttons that might be pressed, if you will, amongst these other people? And recognizing that there's cultural things that make a big difference. If you understand the culture that you're presenting to, because you're part of it, you're more likely to be able to get that presence, if you will, and influence people around, develop that gravitas, because you understand, you know, the nuance, right? You'll understand the historical references that you might use in your speech, or the slang that you might happen to use, or that in this culture you don't touch the women, or in this culture, if you don't do 3 kisses on the cheek, you're considered rude, right? Like if you understand the milieu in which you operate, you'll be more effective. But at the core, you can only be you. And if you don't want to be kissing 3 people on the cheek, or, you know, gee, we're long past COVID, but how many people are really keen on shaking hands and touching people now because everyone's more sensitized to it? And do we respect people's, you know, different views on touching, for example, because of fears of COVID past, right? So yeah, it's different. It's absolutely different. Is it an individual first? I could say what I like and we admire you for that kind of American mindset, or is it an Asian thing where the community must always come first? You know, many cultures, is one where you respect the elders before anything else, right? And or is it one where we value the innovation and brashness of the new and the young and all that kind of, and that's where the focus is, right? But you are the same you, and how you operate in all these different groups means that, your effectiveness of building that gravitas um, may mean that you've got to understand the culture in which you're operating, right? Or let me generalize it and say, unless you know what's important to the audience around you, there's no way that you could show them the part of you that'll make a difference to them. They don't care about you, they care about how you can solve their problem, right? And your executive presence can either help move it along, or it can be the anchor that prevents you from achieving it.
You mentioned youth. Let's talk about ageism. We typically hear this term in terms of aging out, but for the purposes of this question, at the other end of the spectrum, what about young leaders and young aspiring leaders? Do you think it's easier to signal executive presence just by virtue of more mature age, or do you think age is not the factor and it's just how you show up?
I've worked with a lot of people, younger leaders, who were incredibly wise. They really just they really had it all. They had it figured out. They had amazing executive presence, but they also had amazing business acumen. They had it all. And I've also worked with older people that just didn't have a clue. Okay, they didn't have a clue. And so I'd say as a society, we typically will look to older people as having the life experience and therefore the wisdom. And that's true 95% of the time. And we'll look to younger people and we'll say the opposite. Well, they don't know what they don't know. Youth is wasted on the youth and all those other expressions. But once again, that's not always true. I point this out because despite, the positive aspects of ageism, wisdom, experience, and everything like that, or the negative aspects of youth, lack of experience, okay, and everything that goes along with it, I think we need to take a look at people as individuals. And as soon as we start to do a very big broad brush, we sometimes become lazy and say, well, listen, what are the needs of the particular group that we're interacting with, or that we're hoping to interact with? How can I be for them? How can I be there for them at their particular level, right? If I've got older people that are around me, how do I plumb their wisdom and explore some of the experiences that they actually have? If I've got younger people around me, how do they become my teachers? Right? And how do I learn from them? It's not just a question of let's learn about the technology or let's learn about the newfangled whatever it happens to be that so-called young people sort of know intrinsically, etc. But there's a different generational perspective that you could learn from, separate from the techie kind of stuff, right? And how do we take a look at those attitudes as leaders and say, okay, let me just figure this out here. What can I learn from there? What can I incorporate without being fake or about it, but as a way to expand my ability. If I'm looking to develop gravitas, not just for people in my particular age category, but also people that are younger than me. And most leaders probably listening to this, they do have people that work for them that are much younger than themselves, right? How do I make sure that I'm relevant and I can make an impact there as well? Well, also, frankly, if I'm doing a board presentation, making sure that I'm appearing in an appropriate way for that particular audience at the same time.
Okay, we can't talk about executive presence without specifically talking about women. We brought them in some of the examples. Much has been said about women in business. We won't start from the top. Realistically, what's the temperature now? Where should our minds be when we're looking at the executive presence of women?
Um, I think that we need to learn from each other. And I think we also realize that perhaps as a particular man, a particular woman, we can say, what are the bits of what we represent that we think that we need to do better on, and therefore what we see and how we act, how might that, any of those things change slightly so that we can be more successful, whichever gender we happen to be.
One more about women, and then we'll move on. Do you have an opinion on where you see women undercutting themselves in terms of how they show up with their executive presence? Like, is there a blind spot that you can generalize?
Gee, I hate to generalize because I've had the pleasure of working with a number of very, very successful female leaders, my bosses, over the years, and it's worked out very well, and I've learned an awful lot from them. I think that it might be a question almost of class, not of gender. You know, I've seen, for example, some people who are less educated or may have come from, you know, less well-off, areas, for example, and the way they show up, or how, whether it's their clothing or their vocal mannerisms or whatever, it just says, hey, you know something, I'm not ready for a more senior role. I can't communicate in a particular way, or I don't have table manners. You know, if you go to a group, uh, dinner, for example, excuse me, or I don't have the table manners of this particular culture, okay, like a Western culture. So sometimes it's a question of our backgrounds give us who we are, the strengths, obviously, but also the blind spots, right? And so, why is it, for example, that many executive women wear a jacket of some sort? Okay. You know, why is it that many executive men wear a jacket? Why is it so many clerks, for example, male or female, never ever wear a jacket, right? And it's not a question that they can't afford a jacket. Everyone probably has a jacket in their closet. But why is it that more senior people do that? Why is it that some people are more refined at a lunch table, okay, a business lunch, for example, and others had no idea? Right? And so whatever backgrounds are, right? The question of learning some of those basic things. I'm not saying that we're going to suddenly give people table manner lessons, etc. But there's all these things sort of as a whole. Okay, our backgrounds sort of teach us things, and we miss things that we might have learned that we probably need to. And the more senior you become in your organization, sometimes the more important some of these things actually end up being, right? So yes, what do women do versus men? But it's also a cultural thing, right? So
We've talked so much on other sessions like this and with our clients about how the role of leader changes as the organization grows, as your size grows and complexity grows, how communication happens, changes, delegation, all that stuff. What about the executive presence?
oh, that's a great question. As the organization grows, guess what? Your role changes too. And as a leader, you've got to grow along with it. So, if you're doing a startup, for example, there's just you or just a small group of you, and then there's a bigger group of you and a bigger group of you and a bigger group of you, and then a bigger group of you, and you're getting more financing in, and all of a sudden you've got investors and you've got a board of directors, and gee, you're now a public company. Well, thank you very much. There's a public aspect of it, and you're now, a public spokesperson, not just the CEO of this little company. Oh boy. And now there's all these other people that are doing things. That's right. Okay. Your role changes dramatically, right? And some people know everything they need to know. But I said it several times before, they don't know what they don't know. And so how do you make sure that those things you don't know, you actually can learn, right? Or maybe get reinforcement or be reminded of, right? And if your job is to grow the organization, you want to take a look at all of your things. I know a lot of senior leaders, I'm in the Speaking Hall of Fame. I know speaking and communication is exceptionally important. It's a skill separate from the thinking of what to say, right? I know a lot of leaders who say, I've got to buff up my ability to speak, right? I've got to become a better communicator. I've got other leaders, for example, who say, I need executive presence training. I need to learn a little bit more about the things I don't know here. I've got others who say, you know what? I know how to operate a company at level X, but we're now at 2X. There's a lot there that I don't know. I need some coaching for that. There's others that say, something, I used to do an awful lot of personal mentoring of all the people around me. I need to get others to do some coaching because I just don't have as much time. Or, gee, we need to do a lot more professional development for everybody as a whole. So we're all going together. Like there's so much stuff that changes as an organization changes. But the most important is what the leader is doing. Is if the leader at the very beginning was modeling, they know all the answers themselves and they could do everything themselves. And then all of a sudden when they're 5x or 10x the initial, there's just not enough of that leader to go around. So you've got to bring in some of this other stuff to actually accomplish what you before were only able to do because there was such a small group, right? And executive presence, how you show up and how you inspire confidence in your employees and how you model for your employees to your direct reports so that they model for their direct reports and so on. How you the gravitas and the trust that you build in the board of directors when you're at a board meeting. This is all critically important stuff. And earlier, when you were smaller, it might not have been the case that it was so critical, right? But now it is. So the question becomes, at what point do you start to fix this? When it's too late or when it's earlier? Okay, when you might have some capacity to have it sink in. And as you rightly pointed out, sometimes these things have to be reinforced before it becomes the new habit, right? So you can't do it too late. You got to do it earlier.
When it comes to recruiting new employees and succession planning, correct me if I'm wrong, but how come we don't see questions about executive presence, more predominantly in an average job description or for candidate reference checking questions? These words that you're using are so on point, ability to inspire, ability to instill confidence, professional speaking skills. We work with clients regularly who say we lack confidence in our key employees in these areas. So where were those criteria in the hiring process?
It's a huge gap. Okay, it's a huge gap. And I think those are great interview questions. We need to add them to ours at the Braid Trust. Okay. But I think that when you're looking to hire somebody, what you're likely looking for is number one, can they actually solve the specific problem that you're looking to hire for? Do they have the specific skills? Do they know how to, say, operate the machinery? Whether the machinery is doing financial statement analysis or whether it's doing sales or whether it's doing some operational role, whatever it is, right? So that's what we're hiring for very specifically. Okay, tick, here's a smaller group of candidates that meet that. Number two is do they fit our culture, right? Is there direction, kind of the direction where we're going? Is there alignment on all those kinds of things? All of a sudden it's tick, yes. Okay. Not every company sort of asks the question about what might this person's career progression be? Like, of course you'll ask that of the candidate during the actual role, but once they're actually in that role, all of a sudden it's no longer really what the candidate wants, but it's really, okay, what are the opportunities that we might have available coming up over the next number of years that they could develop into? And I think that the professional service firms, the accounting, consulting, law firms and everything, they invest an awful lot in training of their younger, more junior roles to give them bits and pieces of it. But when the economy gets tough, training gets cut and there's a little less of it. And well, gee, if me as a partner, I'm modeling this, they should be able to magically pick it up. And well, the ones who don't, I guess they weren't so smart anyway. And there's all kinds of after the fact rationalization. I'd suggest that this is a good recruitment question. Number one. And I think it's also a good question to ask in terms of the annual appraisal process. Okay, what are you doing? to build that your ability to influence others around you, your ability to inspire confidence in those around, your ability to build trust, right? More than anything else, because if you're able to build trust, that's at the core of inspiring confidence in everything. I have to tell you, from the candidate perspective, though, there's a huge number of cycles spent to saying, hey, how do we make sure that we show up in a way that inspires confidence in the recruiter that they're going, that I'm a good fit. Oh my God, there's so much time. Well, gee, I heard this company likes red ties, not blue ties. I remember those conversations years ago, right? Well, you know something, if we're able to connect with somebody on LinkedIn to do this and that beforehand, and I could drop the little pearls of wisdom that I learned from those there's so much time spent from a candidate's perspective because they're the ones looking for the job, right? And I think that perhaps employers might also think about that particular criteria as well. So
Executive presence, there's skills we can learn. Sometimes the point from A to B is closer, sometimes it's farther, but on that journey to growing into who we want to be, it's very hard to be someone that you're not. What would you say to someone who says, this does not feel like me, this doesn't feel authentic, I want to show up differently? Would you say, this is the road we all take and you will make it too, young grasshopper? Or do you go, there's lots of roles out there and you don't need to be the executive or the leader, like go with your strengths? Like, what would you say to someone who feels demoralized by the journey that has to be made?
So first of all, not everybody aspires to be a senior executive or a partner or whatever the particular role is. You can have executive presence at whatever role that you happen to be in. The example I gave of my former admin assistant, she had incredible executive presence. And that made her exceptionally effective in her job internally, but also when she dealt with people externally, right? I had another assistant a number of years ago. He did not have executive presence, and I think that if he did, he would have been a little bit more effective in his role as well. Thinking back to it right now. So with respect to being the person that you're not, I think sometimes we take the lazy way out and say, well, that's not who I am, and therefore we don't even try it. It's like the parent who says to the kid, here's your broccoli, and the kid says, I don't like broccoli. And the parent says, well, you've not tasted broccoli. And the kid says, well, you're right, but I don't like broccoli, right? I think sometimes we just say, like when perhaps that kid, I just don't like broccoli. And so when you're given a new idea or asked to try something, the question you should ask yourself is it worthwhile giving it a try? Is there something that I could learn by the process? Okay, is there something that I can learn by trying it out a little bit and seeing how it fits, and maybe then making it my own? I'm not trying to be somebody else. An executive presence is not that. But is there something that I could learn along the way? Now, if a leader says to their direct report, this is the way we do things here, we always do fill in the blank, whatever it is. Okay, well, that's a little bit funny. Okay, especially if they're asking you to do something unethical, immoral, or that really, really is bad one way or the other. Okay, but on the other hand, IBM had the reputation, way back, that everyone wore a dark tie and a white shirt, right, and a dark suit jacket of some sort, right? I can't even remember, right, the exact thing. And culturally, that was kind of the way they sort of branded themselves. And if somebody came with something vastly, vastly different, I don't think it was wrong, but it didn't fit the culture of the organization. And you know, which of these things do not belong, right? If you're not able to fit the culture of the organization, that means you can't use the organization's brand to power your own, right? So why not wearing a white shirt, is it so bad, right? On the other hand, we're not talking about, clothing here. I think with your question, if somebody's asking you to be who you're not, you can only be who you are. On the other hand, if they're asking you to approach something in a different way or try a different process or consider doing such and such, ask yourself, what have I got to lose? Now, how might I take something from that request, right? What do I learn along the way? Is it actually more effective? And part two of all this is, I tried it once, it felt very uncomfortable, right? And so the question is does it feel uncomfortable because it's new, or does it feel uncomfortable because it's wrong? And I'd suggest that for the ones that are things that are because it's wrong, don't do it anymore, and have that conversation. But if it's new and it's just a question of comfort, give it a try, and try it for a little bit of time. And maybe it'll become a little bit more comfortable. And maybe because of your unique background, you can sort of pivot it that 3 to 5 degrees, just slightly, so that it really, really does make a difference. And it does feel totally normal to you because you've got practice at it, and because you've successfully embedded it within how you operate as a leader, right? And I think that's sometimes harder than just saying, I don't like broccoli. It's just easier to say, I don't like broccoli. And maybe if you tried it, you'd like it. And by the way, Rania, for the record, I've tried broccoli a bunch of times. I want to like it, but I actually don't like broccoli, so I don't eat it, right? So, but I gave it a try multiple times, right? Try as I might, I don't like it. But we're not talking about broccoli here. We're talking about executive presence.
Randall, I'll ask you one more question, then I'll give you the last word. As I'm listening to us talk about this and all our high-level questions and all the things to ponder and consider, there is lots to ponder and consider. There's lots to take in, and one has to make the time to reflect on that. But in my experience, for myself, for my clients, the magic really only happens, the sinking in really only happens when we review the tape. Like, how much value is there to this very high level discussion when, Randall, we're coaches, we know the value of one-on-one coaching. How far can somebody go with just the thinking, the high level thinking? What do you think?
I think the high level thinking helps build the awareness, right? And once you realize, oh, there might be something here, at that point, that hopefully provides a stimulus to say, okay, well, how do I actually execute on it, right? And some people can say, you know what, let me just go to a high-end clothing store and I'll just tell them who I am and get them to give me a new wardrobe. Gee, I'm going to hire somebody to teach me how to, be my speech coach. Okay, and I'll learn that. Well, they might not have thought about those kinds of things before having had this high level kind of stuff. But the problem with high level stuff is that you could pluck out for yourself the low hanging fruit, right? But hopefully to make a lasting difference, and to make sure that you actually stick to it, and that you get that one-on-one kind of conversation, that requires a little bit more. At one level, it's okay, so fine, let's do a workshop on it, okay, and so at least everyone has a deeper understanding of what this kind of thing actually means. On the other level, it's okay, we're going to actually invest in some of our high potentials, or our some of our leaders, and say, okay, let's see what this looks like. Let's book a series of segments, coaching segments specifically on this. And in the same way that you do that for speaking or management skills or business growth or any of the other kinds of things that you might get coached on, right? And I think that that's really where the rubber hits the road, because everyone can pluck the low-hanging fruit, right? But on the other hand, there's more to life than just low-hanging fruit. If you want to make a difference, if you want to reach the potential that you actually know that you have, and if you want to use all of your leadership levers, you want to make sure that you don't have the boat anchor driving you back. And you might not be aware of the bits and pieces that actually are.
Randall, you get the final word. What takeaway message or do you want our listeners and clients to leave with?
So we've been talking in these two segments about executive presence and everything. And I would suggest two things. Number one, you probably have a few notes about some specific things, right? But every time you have an interaction with people, trust and their confidence in you either goes up or it goes down. Every single interaction, right? Everything that you do, every email that you send, every presentation you give, every team meeting you lead, every meeting with peers where you're an individual contributor, every time others' confidence in you goes up or goes down. So when you're in those meetings, when you're doing those things, the question that you should ask is, who here has got the gravitas and why, right? Gee, when I sent that email or made that presentation, there's something that I could have done that would have increased people's confidence in me and the ideas that I'm sharing, etc. And that's kind of both a self-reflective way of sort of putting some things in the list, right? My suggestion would be to say, hey, listen, maybe there's some stuff you can learn from the outside by others observing you, by others having that time with you. And beyond some of the self-reflective work that you can do on your own or the low-hanging fruit that you can pluck is to actually explore the topic one-on-one in a little bit more a holistic way, because that way hopefully it will help you achieve what you're capable of achieving and not be that heavy weight dragging your career and your organization down.
Thank you, Randall, for the conversation. A big topic today and much more to explore. Thank you to everyone who joined us and is listening. And if any of the issues that we talked about today resonate with you, do reach out. We're happy to have a conversation, share resources. And if you'd like to stay in touch or get invites to more of these events, do email us at info@randallcraig.com or follow us on LinkedIn.